Okay. Welcome back to Leftist Labor History. This is episode 7. It's gonna be the last episode of actual information, and this is about neoliberalism. So we're gonna go from 1980 to present day, and it's currently 2021 when I'm recording this. I am going to come back for one more kind of episode, and that's going to be a bit of a wrap up, and we're gonna discuss some ideas for the future. But this is going to be the last one in the series that will have any kind of facts or data. It can be a little bit tricky to pull history out of something that's really still in the works and still shaping up. But my approach with this episode, so I want to talk about neoliberalism, which is, we're in the neoliberal era currently. And I want to talk about Silicon Valley because I see Silicon Valley as kind of the proving ground for this neoliberal agenda, neoliberal idea. So let's talk about what that means. So at the end of the Cold War, so when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union disbanded, that was the end of the Cold War. That was the end of this competition. There was literally a competition between the United States and Western Europe. The West versus the First World versus the Soviet Union, the Second World, which is the communist part of the world. And when that competition was, ostensibly resolved with capitalism winning, now we enter a new era. So a few things are happening during this era. For one, so at least at the beginning of this era, there was this big selling point that neoliberalism was the best way to achieve, global prosperity. And in the 90s especially, there was a lot of kind of celebration of having resolved this, right? Francis Fukuyama is a scholar who is kind of infamous now for writing a book called The End of History, and he posited that history was over, like capitalism won history. Like this is just the era of peace and prosperity now. And then 9/11 happened in 2001 and just blew his whole thesis out of the water. And since then, it's just kind of the end of history, sure. But in the 90s and in the West, there was all of this. There was a lot of confidence, and I want to talk about that. I'm using Silicon Valley as an example of this, of really this hubris, and the way in which capitalism buys into its own mythology. And but first I want to talk about the mythology. I want to point out the ideology. I want to point out the mythology. I want to point out all of the things that are for the sake of marketing and for selling this neoliberalism. So in 1980, Ronald Reagan is elected, and his whole thing is this mourning in America. He's looking forward to this revitalization of U.S. industry. So what's happening in the 70s, late 60s into the 70s is, the United States had dominated certain industries, kind of heavy industry, automobiles, for instance. And the rest of the world starts to catch up. East Asia starts to catch up. Japan is pumping out really good cars, and people are starting to buy Japanese cars. China and Korea, right, are starting to build up their industrial capacity. Western Europe, which had been decimated by World War II, partly with the help of the United States through the Marshall Project, they're starting to reconstruct their countries and their industries, and now Germany is a big competitor, and so the United States is facing this competition, and capitalists are blaming unions. But for whatever reason, right, the U.S. is starting to lag in terms of manufacturing, and so people are honestly, some people are all too eager to write the obituary for U.S. manufacturing. Again, going back to this idea of deindustrialization, right? So, a lot of people are trying to move away from manufacturing and heavy industry, partly because it has been controlled by unions, and so Reagan is kind of casting about, and then Clinton after him, and when he's elected in '92, they're part of the same neoliberal consensus. Sorry, let me define that a little bit better. So partly, when I say that, I'm talking about this era. So after the fall of the Soviet Union. But this is kind of marked by certain preferences, right? By certain characteristics. The overall idea is that liberal markets are going to set the tone for how we're basically gonna order our society around liberalized markets, and that's just gonna be the way it is. Whereas, before with the Soviet Union, you have a competing model of central planning. Basically, even in the U.S., right, there is kind of a debate going on about what is the best way for broad prosperity? What is the best way to generate like a good, prosperous, wealthy society? And on one hand, you do have, you have this idea of central planning. You have this idea that wealth and value comes from labor. That's Marxist, that's communist, right? So on the extreme end, you have the Soviet Union, you have China. But then, that is still up for debate in the United States as well. And in the neoliberal era, the capitalists are saying, wealth doesn't come from labor. That's ridiculous. It in a sense, this is a new version of an old tale, right? Capitalists have always said, we're the ones, right? We're the ones with money and ideas. We're the ones who create wealth on behalf of. This is magnanimous of us, right? To create wealth on behalf of our whole society. And neoliberalism is just an updated version of that same narrative. And I'm gonna kind of talk about how it's really not all that new. It's updated, but it's the same story. Neoliberalism is also marked. Some kind of new things are, the extent of global free trade is kind of new. So we get globalization. We also get increased financialization, and financialization is a tendency of companies, of firms, to get a big portion of their profits from finance, from lending, from collecting interest, etc., that sort of thing. And more of the economy is going towards finance, towards Wall Street, so to speak. There's also this idea that kind of liberal democracy has won the day. So part of neoliberalism is like, hey, we're going to put away all the bigotry and prejudice. I'm going to talk about that. But anyway, so these are some of the characteristics of the age that we live in, at least in terms of along the terms of the people who are in favor of it. And so in 1980 with Reagan, Silicon Valley is earns that nickname in the 70s. And then it really starts to heat up in the 80s, and in the 90s, by the late 90s, you get the dot-com boom. But I want to go back further in time. I want to go back to 1939. So in 1939, two Stanford-trained electrical engineers, Bill Hewlett and David Packard, started Hewlett-Packard in a garage in Palo Alto. Okay, so I'm just going to lay out this. I'm going to lay out, the wonderful, illustrious history of Silicon Valley, and then I'm going to go back and kind of unpack it and analyze it a little bit, right? Okay, so for starters, so you have the founding of Hewlett-Packard in 1939, and then World War II happens. So let's skip ahead. We'll just kind of leapfrog World War II. In 1951, Frederick Terman, who was the professor of Hewlett-Packard, and several other students who ended up starting electronics companies. So Frederick Terman at Stanford University sets up Stanford Research Institute. And this is part of campus. It's what we would now call a business incubator. So this is, the university is lending a lot of institutional support to get these companies off the ground. And Terman is kind of like, Frederick Terman is kind of the mentor. And so he's considered the father of Silicon Valley. Another of the quote unquote fathers of Silicon Valley, just as an aside, is William Shockley. So Shockley's contribution was developing the silicon semiconductor, whereas before germanium was used in these semiconductors. Silicon is much cheaper. It comes from sand, essentially. And so the reason why we have these devices that are more or less disposable, cheap enough that we just throw them away when their lifespan is over, is because the chip is made from a very cheap material, silicon, as opposed to germanium. So Stanford Institute of Research, an important part about this is that Stanford and this institute, they are getting defense contracts out the ass, right? So the United States federal government is giving them all sorts of money to do research. Hey, we're in this arms race with the Soviet Union. We have unlimited amounts of money to spend to win this competition with communism. So Stanford really becomes a world-class university based on all this money that's coming from the Department of Defense and all of these defense contracts. Silicon Valley would not be what it is without Stanford and without the federal government, just loading it up with cash, just all sorts of money. So in the 50s, 60s, Silicon Valley is the Santa Clara Valley, and it's full of orchards, right? Like it's still pretty rural at that point. San Jose is like a cow town, more or less. And there's just orchards and there's canneries, and that's the big industry. By the 70s, the electronics industry begins to take off. The 80s, you get the personal computer. You get Apple. And then by the 90s, you get the commercial internet in the early 90s, and the spectacular .com bust in the early 2000s. And somehow that did not shake us from our of being enamored with tech companies and slick tech executives, people who pose as the inventors of this wonderful, innovative tech, whatever. So that's Silicon Valley in a nutshell. The reason I'm laying this out is because this is a conservative, right? So we don't think of, when we think of California, when we think of Silicon, even when we think of Silicon Valley, we think of like, hey man, it's like laid back and like people are eating mushrooms or whatever between on the weekends. This is actually a very conservative environment that this is born out of in terms of it's anti-labor. So Hewlett and Packard are part of these trade associations that get together and they talk about how to thwart unionizing. They do not like unions, right? But also all their money is coming from the United States government at the height of the Cold War. So you really are not going to have much tolerance for anything that appears left-wing because you do not want to risk, you don't want to interrupt the gravy train. And so this is kind of a foundational principle of Silicon Valley is do whatever you want on your free time, but when you come into work, like you're a capitalist. And in fact, so the reason I mention Hewlett Packard is that company becomes kind of famous for their management strategy, which is they call it the HP way. And it's part of like the welfare capitalism, right, from the early 1900s, where you're fighting unionism by treating your employees well, more or less. But there's also, this sets the stage for the kind of classic tech company culture. People are free to kind of explore their own ideas. They're incentivized, right, to come up to be innovative at work. Like HP doesn't want people to come in and clock in and do their tasks and go home. They want people to become obsessed with work. They want people to work these long days on their projects that they really care about, and they get rewarded for that kind of thing. That's the HP way. And then that's going to carry through into really into contemporary Silicon Valley culture for the engineers, at least for the white collar jobs. Also, so this idea of starting a company in your garage, which HP, Hewlett Packard was legitimately started in a garage, I guess, in Palo Alto. But this has this stronghold on the American imagination, right? Like this becomes something that all of these other Silicon Valley companies are going to imitate. So whether or not you actually started in a garage with nothing or whatever, you're going to tell everybody like, I started this company in my mom's garage, right? We have these pictures of Jeff Bezos. Apple was started in a garage or whatever. That's this kind of, whether or not that's factually true or genuinely true, like the point is to show like I started from nothing. Everything that I created came out of my own brain. I had the ideas and I'm just fucking plucky, and I picked myself up by my bootstraps. And this is this is the American story going back to the 1600s, before it was the United States. This is a very fundamentally American idea, and it's been bullshit ever since after 1939. It's PR essentially, and we love it. We go nuts for this. Oh my god! Like he started Amazon in his mom's garage. That's amazing, and whatever. It's supposed to show how Anyway, so this is ideology. This is pure ideology. This is the idea that wealth comes from an idea. This is the idea that wealth plus like some venture capital that is going to power the economy. It doesn't come from labor. Manufacturing is moribund and is dominated by labor unions, and we can't compete with the Asian tigers. So this is the mentality in the 80s and going into the 90s, and this survives the .com crash. Just to clarify, this is why I'm talking about this. Like in terms of labor history, this is why I'm talking about this, is because this is an inflection point where the country has decided that wealth does not come from labor pretty decisively, right? Like, the Soviet Union is dead. We've broken the power of these big unions, which thank God, right? And now we're free to have this information economy. This is an economy based on innovation and ideas, and nothing can touch us. Like, we're unstoppable now. So in 1990, the United States overhauled its immigration laws for the first time in a few decades. I think the last time had been in 1965. So this is kind of underway. And Silicon Valley is like, yes, immigration reform. We want skilled workers. We want, electrical and computer engineers from South Asia and East Asia. We want to be able to tap into those labor markets and bring people over here. And liberals are like, yes, like, we're a big melting pot. This is great. Like, we're going to show people that we're not racist because we're going to hire, Taiwanese engineers at our companies or whatever. And part of the 1990 Immigration Act was establishing this visa category for skilled, quote unquote, right? Skilled technical workers that are going to come work in this applies to the whole country, right? But Silicon Valley is going to avail itself of these workers that have been trained in their home countries. This is like hundreds of people a year get these visas. Tens of thousands of people a year are coming from Central America, from Southeast Asia, and they're working in low-wage jobs. So right there, we have kind of an indication, like, somebody's got to continue to do work in this new economy, right? Nobody's really under the illusion that people, don't need to work anymore. Like, we still need, you still need auto mechanics, and you still need, janitors or custodians and so on. You still need all these service industry jobs. And in fact, one of the selling, in the business literature, one of the selling points of Silicon Valley is like, hey, every tech job you creates 5 more jobs down the road. And those jobs are all service industry jobs, more or less, right? But let's look at the typical computer engineer. So let's say, okay, I go to school, I graduate, I get a job working for Apple, let's say, or I get a job working for Google, and I know how to program in X, Y, and Z languages. I know this kind of software. That's kind of where my training is. And, after a few years of work experience, I'm making some pretty good money. Well, every few years, a new programming language is developed, and people start to go that way. Software changes. It's a real churn. So at that point, I have a couple of options. If I'm really, plucky and like don't have a family or any other demands on my time, I'm going to work my 50, 60 hours, 70 hours at Google, and I'm going to go home and hit the books and learn that new programming language. And if I'm going after it, I can then shop my resume around and say, like, hey, this is what I'm making, but I got these skills, I got this experience. Will you pay me more? And if they give me an offer, I can go back to Google, like, hey, match this, or I'm going to go over to this other place. There's a lot of opportunity. If you have, a lot of time and you're bright and you can pick up stuff. Now, let's say I have a family, or I'm taking care of my elderly mother, or I have a disability, and I'm, barely, hitting that 45 hours a week at Google or whatever. After a couple of years, a new programming language comes out, and Google is like, hey, we really need somebody who knows Ruby, for instance. And I'm like, oh, well, I don't know Ruby, but like I can learn it. Like, will you train me? And they're like, yeah, no thanks. Yeah, we're not going to train you, because they have the option. They can outsource your job. They can hire somebody from India who knows who has more up-to-date training that you don't have. Or, you know what I mean? Like you're just out of luck, and you're going to have to maybe take a pay cut and find somewhere else. Anyway, they're done with you. They've used you up. By the way, so when they're hiring these people from India and from Taiwan, they're paying them a lot less, right? So if you're coming from India, you're getting a big pay raise, but the salary that Google is paying you is a lot less than, the person with American citizenship. Now let's say you're coming from India, you manage to get a visa, and you come work for Google, let's say. You're making good money, right? It's worth it for you. But after a couple years, again, you're working long hours. Things aren't all that great. You see people around you making more money than you, and you're like, well, how can I make more money? Well, you're kind of bound by visa requirements. So like your visa is really tied to your employer. So you don't really have the liberty because of all the process, the legal fees and the red tape. You can't really shop your resume around like people with citizenship can. So you're more or less stuck to your employer. So if you get a bad deal, luck of the draw, like tough luck. You're probably just gonna ride it out until your visa's up, or until you need a visa extension or whatever. Another thing is that statistically, so people have studied this, and if you are not, so all of the really, really cushy, good jobs, the executive jobs, the marketing job, the sales jobs, the marketing jobs, that stuff goes to white men by and large. There are exceptions, but for the most part, those really cushy positions are reserved for white men. And then a few white women here and there, right? Like, so look how progressive Silicon Valley is. Now there's like women in these white women in these executive roles. Again, statistically speaking, there are exceptions. So you're this Indian engineer, you're getting passed up for all of these really, really lucrative jobs, and you're really just kind of there as a workhorse, just cranking out code. Now let's look at, so let's say that you are a Mexican American woman. So we'll go back in time a little bit. You're working in a cannery in the 50s and the 60s in the Santa Clara Valley. It becomes Silicon Valley, and all the jobs now, like the production line jobs, are making semiconductors. So you say, okay, I've got production line experience. I've worked around these machines. They give you a job. It's a low paying job, and now you're more than likely exposed to some sort of hazardous chemical with the bare minimum of training and protective equipment. The trend also, as Silicon Valley starts getting all this money, the trend is you're not going to work for Apple. You're not going to work for Hewlett-Packard directly. You're going to work for a company that contracts your labor to, produce whatever microchips for Apple and Hewlett-Packard. So if you have a problem at your workplace, you get sick, for instance, from the hazardous chemicals, you don't have a union. You can't really even appeal to Apple or HP because they're going to be like, well, what do we care? We're not your employer. And you can't you can't afford a lawyer, most likely. You can't go to the press because, who the hell cares about some podunk production line, contractor that nobody's ever heard of. So, and then your visa, runs out and you are going back to, Mexico. So that's kind of that's a cross section of employment opportunities in Silicon Valley. Meanwhile, rent and housing prices are going through the roof. And then even after the bust, they do not. They kind of dip back down, and then they shoot up again. So this is what you get from the Silicon Valley economy. And into the 2000s, the idea has been to spread this economy throughout the whole country and throughout the whole world. This is akin to, this is a gold mining operation, essentially, right? So like a few people strike it rich, which is a combination of, some of these guys are bright, and some of these guys are, hard workers, and then the rest of it is just sheer dumb luck, right? And those guys make fantastic amounts of money. And then everybody else, a lot of other people just get absolutely screwed, or they make a little bit of money. But the point is that this is very unequal. It's very unstable. You really don't know if your prospect is going to pan out. And this is exactly what happened. Like in the 90s, Google just kind of won. There were a bunch of other search engines, and nobody really knew what a search engine was. I mean, they knew what a search engine was. They did not know how to make money off of a search engine. Facebook did not know how to make money. Right? So like MySpace failed, and Friendster failed, and so on, and Facebook just figured it out. And part of that is just dumb luck. Like they had a prospect in the hills, and it happened to produce gold. And there was a lot of hard work that went into it. I'm not going to deny that. But like, this is the economy that neoliberalism wants to sell to us. If you want a stable job, if you want to work 40 hours a week and go home to your family, and you want to retire at age 65 and have a pension, that's not what Silicon Valley wants for you, and that's not what they want for them. They want this this boom and bust cycle. They want people to either become, fabulously wealthy, or to wash out. But that's not a good sales pitch, right? So you have to really, really sell people on the billionaires, and like, hey, maybe this could be you, right? You should buy into this, because don't you want to be, incredibly wealthy? Well, I mean, you're not going to be Bill Gates. You're not going to be Elon Musk. Like you have a better chance of actually winning the lottery, which will ruin your life. That's another topic. But the point is, so what unions offered, right? And so you can't really have, to go back to this idea of the HP way, right? You can't really have unions at HP. Like that's the way that their incentives are structured, is they don't want you to come in and punch a clock. And they're going to reward you for being the type of person that doesn't want to just punch a clock and collect a paycheck. I just want the paycheck. Like, I don't give a shit. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, that's great for those people that want to do that. But a lot of people just have to pay rent to survive and do what they actually care about. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you cannot have, this is a very unstable idea to export to the rest of the entire economy, because most people are going to just become screwed over. They're either going to be exploited, or they're going to, risk it all on something that's not going to pan out. And you're going to have a few people. And then, of course, and then the rest of the economy becomes service industry. Everybody is serving the few people that have $1 billion. And that is the goal, because the people who have billions of dollars are the ones in charge. But really, this is not a great system, in my humble opinion. But again, but you have to sell all of these schmucks on the idea that's going to make you rich. So you talk up this idea of starting a company in your garage. You talk up, all of this, the great things that Silicon Valley does for the company. You talk about how manufacturing is obsolete. That's another thing, by the way. So I mean, this is something that it seems kind of ludicrous when you think about it, but this is something that the Silicon Valley boosters really talk up as like, manufacturing is like, we don't need to worry about that. Everything that, like, my phone here was created by, yeah, it's an iPhone 12. It was created by a person. That is the product of somebody's labor. Yeah, it was an idea at some point, and lots of people went in and developed, a product that has appealed to millions and millions of people. But somebody had to assemble that phone, and in fact, if you look at manufacturing jobs, so manufacturing jobs in Silicon Valley did not actually go away like people said they did. The number of jobs increased. Manufacturing did become a smaller share of the economy, replaced by tech jobs, administrative jobs, service industry jobs. But you're not going to, I mean, you're always going to have to produce some kind of product to sell people. Even if it's software, I mean, that is somebody's labor, right? So wealth and value continues to come from labor, regardless of what neoliberals want to believe. Another thing, so I've talked about, when I talked about the Gilded Age and the railroads, I mentioned Richard White in his really great book, Railroaded. He wrote that at Stanford I think it was published in like 2005. So he's writing this during, as Silicon Valley is heating and then overheating and collapsing. And he draws all these parallels to railroads. I just made an analogy to gold mining. He sees a lot of parallels to railroads, and you read that book and it's like, yeah, absolutely. This is a bunch of, it's a big, like Silicon Valley. I mean, this tech company model largely is a big Ponzi scheme, right? So a lot of it is attracting funding, getting your cut, and then not caring about what happens to the company. And then another large part of it is you are using your clout and your influence to change labor markets. This is what we've seen with Uber. Uber is not a tech company. You know what I mean? Like, okay, you have an app, but is that what a tech company is? I mean, it is part of Silicon Valley because Silicon Valley has become this model of an industry where you are disrupting things, and those things that you're disrupting are actually usually quite good, like cab drivers unions, right? But you're using all of your influence. I mean, Uber is famously like just bleeding money. They've never turned a profit. So you have a company that's not even profitable, that like local politicians are like going crazy for, like it's the monorail from the Simpsons episode, and you're doing all that to change the way that our economy is structured, and we all have to think that that's a good thing because these people appear successful, and I mean, like, and yeah, those few people are very successful, like the people who are making money off of Uber, who are not going to suffer when the company fails. Like, yeah, that's success in its own way, but it's going to leave just a huge crater behind. Like this idea of disruption is more and more people are beginning to realize, like, this is a terrible idea. Why are we just disrupting things? And it's because we've been sold this idea of this bright, shiny future. This is a new frontier, and it's using a lot of the same sales pitches as the railroads. It's using, the HP way that was started in 1939. Like, this stuff is not as new and shiny as we've been led to believe. It's the same scam, just repackaged in new wrapping paper. So I guess just to like wrap it up, I mean, I feel like this is pretty obvious, but like, don't listen to the Silicon Valley grifters. Do not put any stake into what Elon Musk has to say at all for a second. He's a huge liar. I mean, this seems apparent to me. But anyway, I hope that this has been informative in the ways that our bright, shiny new economy that everyone in power is trying to impose on us is a bill of goods. It's just a crock of shit. And I mean, I don't really know how to resist that because it's happening in real time. This is happening just in the present, and I'm a historian, so I got nothing for you. But I'm gonna come back for one final episode. It's gonna be like our epilogue, and we're gonna talk about the future. We're gonna talk about our dark future. Anyway, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.